Hey everyone. I hope everyone has been keeping up with the Scientology and the Aftermath show on A&E. I am making this the night after the last episode on L. Ron Hubbard and his life. Quite an interesting episode, and it got me thinking about a few things about Hubbard, the church, and the philosophic subject or technological subject, or a little bit of both, of Scientology itself. And whether I started wondering about whether these things could be separated out. And after looking at it, thinking about it, reading some things, doing a little bit of research, talking to some people, I thought I'd make a video here and discuss this a bit. Because I think that there's the idea that Hubbard was a guy, and he came up with these discoveries, and he wrote them all down and gave all these lectures, and then he died, and Scientology continues on. And then there is this subject of Scientology, which exists separate from the Church of Scientology, which is the organization and structure that Hubbard put in place. He created it all himself, or at least it is his creation. He certainly took credit for all of it. A lot of people contributed, but it wouldn't have happened without him. That much we can say for sure. And these things sort of create a bit of a trinity, sort of a trinity of trouble, really, between Hubbard and the church and Miscavige, actually. That's sort of your trinity of trouble there, because Miscavige is the other, David Miscavige, the current leader of Scientology, is sort of the other component to this equation that people look at and will, cast shade on, get a little upset with David Miscavige and claim that he is the poison pill and the problem with Scientology overall. Well, I'm going to talk about the reason why I don't agree with much of any of this, and I think that it's all sort of a bundle, and I'm going to kind of talk about why. First off, the Scientology as a subject is different from the Church of Scientology, and this is demonstrated by people who leave the Church of Scientology and yet still practice Scientology. They use some of the techniques and principles and ideas and practices that they learned when they were in the church. It is always, when they leave, it is never the case that they use all of Scientology when they leave. They cherry pick, always, and I'll explain why. So let's go ahead and actually start with this quote here I have on my computer from L. Ron Hubbard. Now, this was a policy letter. Hubbard wrote bulletins, which were red on white, and he wrote policies, which were green on white, and the policies were for how to run the organization, but they often also included instructions and guidelines for using his methods and techniques of improvement, auditing, training, that sort of thing that they do. In this policy letter, he wrote on 10 July 1986, which of course was after he died, so this policy letter was issued based on his notes, I suppose. And in it, it says here, in 1965, I wrote the policy letter, Keeping Scientology Working. And I've done, by the way, a full breakdown on that policy letter and how off the rails it is as far as what it does to people's thinking when they're in Scientology. But he wrote this policy letter. Most people who have been doing any Scientology watching for any period of time are familiar with this concept of KSW, or keeping Scientology working, this idea of keeping everything pure and exactly, precisely the way Hubbard wrote it. And it says here, in 1965, I wrote the policy letter. It appears as the first item of nearly every Dianetics and Scientology course check sheet, and with good reason. Unswerving and relentless application of that one issue by every Scientologist is our only certain means of keeping the technology pure and the future hope of mankind alive. Now, don't think small here. It may not be generally understood, however, that the principles given in that policy letter do not apply only to what is commonly referred to as the tech, the first dynamic technology given in HCO bulletins. You see, when tech goes out, the PC suffers. PC is the pre-clear, the person who's receiving Dianetics or Scientology auditing or counseling. When the tech goes out, the PC suffers. In other words, when tech is not applied correctly, according to how Hubbard lays out it's supposed to be applied, then the PC suffers. When admin goes out, in other words, administrative guidelines and policies, when admin goes out, the org declines. Therefore, to keep Scientology working, all of Scientology, one must insist on standard tech and admin. The principles of unvarying adherence to precise technology, constant alertness to tech alteres, in other words, changes, and insistence that every Scientologist abide by these rules apply just as severely to the third dynamic technology of standard administration, policy. Okay, so, and of course third dynamic meaning groups. So Hubbard's saying here that policy has to be followed just as rigorously as his technology. And if you're going to call yourself a Scientologist and use Scientology, then Hubbard's dictates are that it is all of Scientology, the tech and the policy. Now, I'm making that point because some people who talk about Scientology or who leave the church and continue using Scientology will not follow or use Hubbard's policies, even though he was very clear as the creator, writer, founder, source of Scientology that all of it was a package deal. And this is kind of an important concept as far as the purity of Scientology goes and as far as using Scientology goes, because it's Hubbard's creation. Whether he's the discoverer of it or the compiler of it or the organizer of it, and whether he took other people's ideas and bound them all together into this mass called Scientology, he's the one who said that it is a complete and whole package and it only works if you do all of it. I think this is a fairly important point. It gets brushed off and cast aside by people who leave the church because they have to justify not using or following the church or the church's rules or guidelines in order to continue to get whatever gains they feel they're getting from Scientology. And in fact, this also applies now, now the other part of this, put that aside for a second, is L. Ron Hubbard himself. And as we saw on Leah's show last night, Hubbard was quite a bit different from the person he presented himself to be to Scientologists and to the world at large after the publication of Dianetics in 1950. He completely rewrote his entire biography. Not that he wasn't lying before 1950 about his war record and various things, his education, for example, or his various adventures and exploits, but he really took on some pretty grandiose claims after 1950, and he told war stories and all kinds of adventure stories during the course of talking about Dianetics and Scientology in his lectures. So he really, kind of created this whole other persona. This is important because Hubbard was, as laid out in the show and as I've laid out and talked about at length on my channel here in various videos, Hubbard was a pathological liar. And the problem that you're dealing with when you're dealing with a pathological liar is deciding what can you believe out of what the person's telling you, right? You have to decide. Every time the person opens their mouth and says something, when you've proven that, 5 out of 10 things they say is a lie, or 7 out of 10 things they say is a lie, then, how do you know which 5 or which 3 of what the person says to believe? Right? It's impossible to be able to tell because you have to fact check the person over and over again. That gets tiring. And yet there are people who will give Hubbard a break by saying, well, yes, he elaborated on his life. He lied. Yes, he was a liar. You can't believe the things that he says. But his tech, his discoveries were genius, and they work, and they're amazing. And you just kind of go, okay, these two things don't really go together. And we'll get to a little bit of why in a bit later on in this video. I'll break down some of my reasoning on this as to why these things are kind of why Hubbard, why the subject of Scientology and the Church of Scientology, why they're all a package. You can't really separate these things out when you're considering the truthfulness or the validity of them. Okay. just to cover a couple other things in terms of how people justify belief in Hubbard's discoveries or principles, you know, there's all kinds of ways. It's a laundry list of things that I could go over. But like, for example, you have him flunking out of college or him flunking out of high school. Yeah, the apologists will say that doesn't matter because you can't trust institutions anyway. And lots of geniuses never went to college or flunked out of college and went on to become geniuses and did amazing, wonderful things anyway. So Hubbard gets a pass on that. So it's, you know, it doesn't really matter to them that he's, you know, that he lied about those things. They can kind of rationalize that. What about his war record? What about the fact that he wasn't wounded in battle? What about the fact that he never saw a day of combat, actually, right? What about all that? Oh, well, that's all explained by the fact that the military actually sheep-dipped his military records. In other words, what we know of his military records actually aren't true. That's a fabrication made by the military, not by Scientology, but by the military. Because Hubbard was a covert intelligence operative, and so that's the public records are just imaginary, just made up, because they couldn't reveal what his real records were. This sheep-dipped line came from Fletcher Prouty, who was a self-claimed former military intelligence and army officer, military officer, and he worked for the church. He was a bit of a, he kind of liked the conspiracies. And so that was the story he came up with the church ran with for a while. But there's so many, again, there's so many holes and problems in that story. And if you're going to go Occam's razor on the whole thing, in other words, the simplest explanation is probably the right one, that whole sheep dip thing just doesn't make any sense. You can just kind of throw that out the window. Then you also get people who will claim, okay, well, Hubbard might not have come up with all of the research and discoveries himself. They'll give a bit when you point out that, hey, look, there's plagiarism here and here and here and here. And he clearly got this from this place, and and this person over here, like Study Tech, this was come up, the Burners came up with this, Hubbard didn't. And they will then say, well, yes, but he was a real genius in organizing and sorting and selecting out the truth of things. And Hubbard even said that in his lectures. He said that not everything in Scientology is original with him. You can find it in other works. But the genius of Scientology is that Hubbard could select these things and put them together in such a way that it made this wonderfully 100% workable technology, which doesn't really work out so well, but that's the claim. And so Hubbard apologists or supporters will fall in line with that and say that, yeah, sure, I'll acknowledge that he might not have come up with all of it, but I will still say that he was still a genius, and he still put it all together in such a way that nobody else did, and so therefore, you know, it's all wonderful. Such people generally coming out of the church, as I think I mentioned before, also tend to put all of the blame and responsibility for the problems with the church on David Miscavige. He becomes this, you know, this pillar of evil who has destroyed all of Hubbard's good works and has, you know, altered it beyond all recognition and that sort of thing. Not so much. So Hubbard is kind of inseparable from Dianetics and Scientology because he himself claimed to be source. He was the source of all of Dianetics and Scientology. There isn't somebody else who is supposed to have been responsible for the final product. Even if you acknowledge that Hubbard took these bits from other places, it still is his baby. So you can't really separate out Hubbard from his subject. Other subjects, and this is, you know, when you have a science, and Scientology, I think I've pretty clearly shown in a number of my videos now that Scientology is not a science. I mean, we can just take the claims that Scientology is resting on scientific principles, is scientifically valid, and we can throw all that out the window. It is a philosophy. Okay, I'll give it that. Because a philosophy is just anything a philosopher says, and Hubbard and a philosopher is pretty much anybody who calls themselves a philosopher. I mean, that's really pretty simple. So you have no testing, you have no peer review, you have no one trying to duplicate the results of Scientology outside of Scientology or Dianetics. So, because they never, there's no replication of results, independently verified and validated. Hubbard actually wouldn't even allow that sort of thing. He always talked down to anybody who even suggested trying such a thing. So it's not a science, then we don't have to treat it as a science, and we don't have to give it the respect or dignity of a science. That immediately removes the whole idea that Hubbard is just like Newton, Einstein, Bill Gates, right? Turing. I mean, anybody who came up with a scientific discovery or discoveries and publish those results. We don't look at Isaac Newton's personal life and go and use that to reflect on or make opinions or form value judgments about physics or about calculus, because what he discovered and what he researched and put together has been validated by other people. It's not an opinion-based science. Calculus is not an opinion-based math. It works. If it didn't work, people wouldn't use it. It wouldn't produce results. And it wouldn't be those results wouldn't be duplicatable under standard scientific or mathematical conditions. Okay? A computer and a computer program and code always works, no matter who's doing the typing, no matter under what circumstances they're doing it. If you have a computer and the computer is programmed a certain way and you punch in this code, you get this result 100% of the time. So it's not a reflection of Bill Gates' personality as to whether that code is going to work or not. It stands alone and separate from the person who did the discoveries. Not so when you start getting into philosophy and specifically Scientology. Scientology very much is a direct reflection of L. Ron Hubbard's personality, ideas, attitudes, and opinions. They're scattered throughout the materials of Dianetics and Scientology. So it's not scientific. Okay, so his discoveries have to be looked at, his philosophy, his ideas, his writings have to be looked at in tandem with who L. Ron Hubbard actually was as a person. His background, his cultural makeup, his education, and his life story. A lot of the examples and stories and discoveries of Scientology come straight out of Hubbard's life story, right? So these two things, I think, are very clearly meshed together. So Hubbard's claims about the efficacy of Dianetics are based right from the get-go on proven lies. He claimed, as Leah went over and Mike went over in Leah's show last night, he claimed that he cured himself using Dianetic techniques. This was a very core claim right from 1950 on that Hubbard was making to prove that Dianetics actually worked and that it would cure the lame, it would cure blindness, it would cure cancer, leukemia, a whole host of things. Any psychosomatic illness or condition, Hubbard claimed Dianetics would cure. Not alleviate, not make a person feel a little better for a little while, cure. So, the lie that he cured himself with it actually matters when you're looking at the workability and truthfulness of Dianetics. If Newton claimed that calculus had cured his blindness or his inability to use his right hand or something, and we found out that that wasn't the case, that he couldn't, that he was, blind or whatever, he couldn't use his right hand, that would be an immediate reflection on the validity of calculus. Because you go, well, that didn't do that. So, again, so these are inseparable claims from the science or from the subject matter. The other thing is that we know Hubbard's life story from him and from others. And part of Scientology is a whole system of ethics and justice, which includes a thing called the overt motivator sequence. A person commits an overt. An overt is a bad action or a failure to take action when one should that has bad or disastrous or injurious consequences. So, if you saw a child about to be run over by a train and you had the ability and time to go, get the kid off the tracks and you just stood there and watched it happen, that would be an overt. In the same sense, if a child was standing next to a train track and a train was coming and you pushed the child into the train, that would be an overt, right? Either way, action or inaction, omission, an act of omission, or commission. Hubbard wrote about this at length. This was a big deal in Scientology, and it's all about why it is that, it goes into the whole thing about being critical and having overts, and there's all kinds of stuff on this. But here's the thing. Hubbard freely committed overts with no regard for consequences to others, even within the world of Scientology. I'm not talking about pre-Scientology, I'm talking about during all the years of Scientology. And this included throwing his own wife and kids under the bus whenever he felt threatened, or like when he was about to, when he became an unindicted co-conspirator for the Operation Snow White program in the 1970s, he didn't go to jail. No way. Mary Sue, his wife, is the one who went to jail. And then he disconnected from her. He didn't see her ever again to keep himself. Why would he do that? So that he wouldn't go to jail. Now, that's not an overt. I don't know what is, because he was the one who was actually responsible for running the Snow White program. He wrote it. He watched it be executed. He gave instructions on what to do. He monitored it on a daily basis. We have witnesses who have talked about this. So there's no, so this guy, and we already found out all about his kids in the Aftermath show. He did not have a high regard for his family, much less, his previous wives and kids and the way he treated all of them. This was not a family man. This was not a guy who was, in other words, this was a guy who was not following his own philosophy. Okay, it's really coming down to the point here. I could enumerate on Hubbard's overts for hours, all the things that he did to other people. I mean, throwing a 3-year-old in a chain locker on the ship for days on end, that's an overt. Coming up with the RPF program and subjecting people to mental and physical and emotional torture for years. I mean, that's an overt, right? If Hubbard was truly on the way to happiness and followed his own moral precepts, none of those things ever would have happened. Even if bad things had occurred, even if mistakes had been made, even if he had inadvertently committed overts, he would have gone out of his way to make up for it, take responsibility for it, right? Own up to and fess up to his own crimes or overts, and he would have tried to make good on those things, but he did not. Instead, he went into hiding, and he, died alone in a ditch. So that's not exactly a Scientology success story. And here's the guy who came up with it all himself. So if he couldn't even apply it to himself and his own family, then how workable is this supposed to be, right? Again, kind of inseparable. Hubbard, the tech, right? Now, another claim that's often made by people who leave the church and continue using the tech is that the tech works. Oh yeah? I would argue that point, because I have yet to see a single person who leaves the Church of Scientology and continues using the tech who does not alter it or change it or cherry pick from it in some fashion or another, and sometimes in very obvious and blatant ways. The way I see it, you have 3 or 4 things here going on when you have people who are claiming that science outside of the church, that the tech still works or still produces results for them or is still good despite the evil of the church and the evil of Miscavige or even the evil of Hubbard. Okay? One, you have to alter it practically beyond all recognition in order for it to continue to produce some kind of a result on you. So is that really Scientology? I don't think so. 2, simply, if you are going to use it exactly precisely the way it's done in the church, you have to accept substandard results because no clear and no OT actually exists. There is no one who meets the dictionary Hubbard definitions of what a clear is or what an OT is. So sure, you can use it outside the church, but you're not going to get the results Hubbard claimed. So why would you be doing it? I don't know. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me because it seems pretty obvious that if it doesn't do what it says it's supposed to do, it doesn't work. I mean, that's literally the definition of work, is produces the result expected, right? And finally, I think this applies pretty much across the boards as far as I'm concerned to most long-term or short-term independent Scientologists, people who leave the church and still use it. And that is the placebo effect. Now, I haven't really talked about this much. I haven't done a ton of research on it, but I did find some things here that I thought were fairly interesting about it. I think there is a lot more to know about this. I don't think medicine or science has figured out the placebo effect at all. I think there's a lot more research that should be done on this because I find it endlessly fascinating. In one study involving asthma, people using a placebo inhaler did no better on breathing tests than sitting and doing nothing. But when researchers asked for people's perception of how they felt, the placebo inhaler was reported as being as effective as medicine in providing relief. One of the most common theories is that the placebo effect is due to a person's expectations. If a person expects a pill to do something, then it's possible that the body's own chemistry can cause effects similar to what a medication might have caused. For instance, in one study, people were given a placebo and told it was a stimulant. After taking the pill, their pulse rate sped up, their blood pressure increased, and their reaction speeds improved. When people were given the same pill and told it was to help them get to sleep, they experienced the opposite effects. Experts also say that there is a relationship between how strongly a person expects to have results and whether or not results occur. The stronger the feeling, the more likely it is that a person will experience positive effects. There may be a profound effect due to the interaction between a patient and healthcare provider. And I'll remind everybody that in Scientology counseling, there is an auditor and a patient, pre-clear, person receiving it. And the relationship between those two and the interaction between them may very well have a profound effect on the effects of the efficacy of the processes. The fact that, now this is important too, the fact that the placebo effect is tied to expectations does not make it imaginary or fake. Some studies show that there are actual physical changes that occur with the placebo effect. For instance, some studies have documented an increase in the body's production of endorphins, one of the body's natural pain relievers. All right, so now from all of that, there is definitely an expectation on the part of people who leave Scientology that auditing works, and it's going to continue to have the same results it had on them that it had when they were in the church. For people who were not ever in the church and who come in and get an auditing session from an independent Scientologist, they are given an indoctrination and expectation of what to expect. It's a standard part of doing auditing on someone that you educate them. In fact, the word is indoctrinate them. That's the Scientology term for it. on what to expect, what's going to happen in the auditing session, and what's expected of them, including what the end results will be. So that's all part of the package of doing auditing. No one just goes in to a Scientology auditing session and just sits down and picks up the cans, or into a Dianetics session and just sits down and closes their eyes and has no idea of what's about to happen. That would be doing Scientology wrong, because you're supposed to indoctrinate the person. And Hubbard, in his bulletins, actually said, don't do that. They called it coffee shop auditing, where you just meet some guy in a coffee shop and you just start auditing him and he doesn't even know what's happening. Hubbard said the results from such a practice will not be good, or will be negligible. Why? Because of what I just read about the placebo effect. Right? Because if there's no expectation of what the results are going to be, then the person, the pre-clear, doesn't have those results all the time, you see? So I think this is a very powerful part of why Scientology auditing continues to be used by people outside the church. Now, I'm not saying that my opinion is that they shouldn't do that. It's really more a matter of, my question is, why would you do that? It doesn't make any sense to me, knowing what I know about all of the tech of Scientology now. But, people want to feel good, and they really don't care how they go about feeling good. For some people, that's drugs. For some people, that's alcohol. For some people, that is Scientology auditing. Whatever. I'm really not making a moral judgment about it here. But I am questioning why someone would do that when we have these points here that you have to either alter it, you either have a substandard result that you have to live with, and that's what you use it for. You have to cherry pick the hell out of it in order for it to continue to make sense in some fashion or another, or it's placebo effect. Because the bottom line really is this: Scientology as an organization and Scientology as a subject really are inseparable. And I think this is an important point to make. The Church of Scientology, as it stands now, is not the same Church of Scientology that it was when L. Ron Hubbard died. However, the Church of Scientology as it stands now is the inevitable conclusion and result of L. Ron Hubbard's policies and his tech. If his tech worked, and if his policies worked at detecting and finding and rooting out people who were truly suppressive people, antisocial personalities who did not have the good of the world at large in mind, then David Miscavige would have been found out before he ever got started. If the technology of Scientology worked, if the e-meter worked, if the sec checks worked, then, and if all of the ethics procedures worked, then no suppressive person would have been able to last in Scientology for years on end, much less decades. People like myself, Mike Rinder, Leah Remini, any number of people who have come out and spoken, Aaron, Mary, the list goes on and on. All of us were in for a very long period of time. I don't know too many critics and exes who are out right now who were in for less than 5, 10, 15 years, if not their entire life. How is it possible that you can have the tech to discover, detect, root out, and deal with suppressive people and fail thousands of times to find such people? Right? That just doesn't make any sense. The inevitability of Scientology's destruction, its demise, its downfall, is written into, the DNA of it. And the inevitable result of someone like David Miscavige taking over Scientology is, as far as I'm concerned, a given, based on the big grandiose claims without the results. And that, in a nutshell, is Scientology. So I just wanted to throw a few words about all of this out there for you guys this week. I hope you found this interesting, educational, and informative. Of course, please leave any feedback, comments, or criticisms of anything I've said here in the comment section. I'll be happy to look at those and consider what you have to say. And I will talk to you guys again soon.